So we talked a little bit about how brick and concrete could be used as a sort of language to talk about the relative importance of buildings based on the kind of patterns that they showed to the outside world. But the scale that brick and concrete allowed also spoke meaningfully in a time when the politics in Rome were changing from that of a republic, relatively small-scale democratic political institutions, to an empire, where the former republic was ruled by increasingly powerful and increasingly autocratic emperors. Architecture was one of the tools that the emperors used to both convince Romans of their power, but also to sort of barter with them. In other words, in exchange for the emperors having untold power and riches, the people, particularly of Rome, got benefits in the form of entertainment and amenities, basically, in the city. Augustus, the first person we think of as a Roman Empire, marked this change. There were 2 centuries following his ascension of basically peace and quiet throughout the empire, and this led to a vastly increased economy, an energized society, and this concentration of wealth and power came with some risks, right? If you do things that make you unpopular as an emperor, you risk being deposed by someone else's army or by the mob, the people in the streets. So there's definitely a need to create amenities to keep the public happy, but also to monumentalize their own reigns, right? The emperors built monuments to show not just to the people alive then, but to posterity, that they had been this powerful. The Pax Romana meant that there were the resources available, that there was both the labor, the materials, and basically the money to trade for the stone and the brick that went into these monuments. The first of these, the Flavian Amphitheater or the Colosseum, really set the tone for the Roman monuments, the imperial monuments. It was dedicated almost entirely to the public, and it was both a piece of infrastructure, a sports stadium, but also a piece of absolute propaganda, right? That was designed to show to the Roman people how munificent or how giving the emperor really was. And when you look at the list of major emperors who ruled over the next 3 or 4 centuries, a lot of these names are familiar to us from the buildings that they built. And we'll look both in this lecture and in the next one at, in particular, the bath complex. When we talk about vaults in the next lecture, each one of these emperors built a large baths complex that used advanced building technology to put their mark, basically, on the city. And Trajan was the greatest builder of these, and he worked with someone who today we would call an architect, Apollodorus, who worked on or helped design about half a dozen of the major works. And Trajan's name is sort of everywhere. He has a forum, he has baths, he has a market that we've already seen, he has a memorial column, etc. But as I said, these projects really start with the Colosseum, and it's one of the major sites when you go to Rome today. It's one of the great tourist sites, but it's also an important reflection both on the scale that Romans were able to build at and the sort of daily urban life that you must have had if you were a member of virtually any class in the city. It is only about half there today. It was both fell into disrepair and was mined for its stonework and its brick and the little quantities of iron and bronze that it had in it during the medieval period. It also served as animal barns during the sort of dark ages when Rome was mostly an agricultural city. So it is not in a great shape, but it's also, of course, being almost 2,000 years old, it has every right to be a ruin. The amphitheater as a Roman type evolved from Greek theaters, and you can sort of, one of the main differences, the way we think about Greek and Roman culture, Greek theaters were all about putting on a staged spectacle and audience members sort of looking one direction at the stage, whereas the Roman Colosseum was much more of an arena where people did battle, or people and animals did battle. and the theater in the round gives you a sense of the more sort of celebratory atmosphere that must have accompanied those. The full encirclement, of course, doubled the number of spectators who could see an event. And it, of course, signified this move toward these sort of mass rallies and mass events over the more sort of sober theater events that you would have seen in ancient Greece. The first of these amphitheaters, we think, was in Pompeii, or the first large-scale one, built in about 80 BCE. Julius Caesar built an amphitheater, and we know that Augustus did as well, both of which are kind of lost. There's nothing left of either of those. But Vespasian commissioned the Colosseum to hold, specifically to hold public spectacles, many of them quite bloody and gruesome by today's standards. He did it in part as a refutation of the emperor that had gone before him. Nero's reputation is probably worse than he really deserved, but he had not been overly popular. And Vespasian had the Colosseum built on what had been Nero's palace garden. So taking a piece of Rome that had been off limits to the citizenry and turning it into a space for public events had very, very clear political aims. The construction itself is relatively simple. There are 80 wedges, all of radial barrel vaults, so fairly simple construction. Nothing that we didn't see in the previous segments about vault construction. These vaults all support tiers of seats that are made of concrete, fired brick, and then as you go up the structure, the materials get lighter and lighter. So it starts in brick and concrete, becomes travertine, and at the very top was tufa, this lightweight pumice-like stone, and timber in the top level, and all of it was encased in a shell of carved travertine. The floor of the arena, very famously, was built of timber and supported by a labyrinth of underground passageways, so that gladiators, animals, treats of all type could be sort of winched up through the floor to join in the fun on stage. These got more and more elaborate as time went on. And what's interesting to me anyway is that there are no real long spans, right? It's not that this is a huge work of structural daring. It's just that the Colosseum was so large, there's so much of it there, that you gather that there must have been an extraordinary amount of administration, right, amount of organization that went on to get the millions of bricks to the job site, to get all of the laborers to the job site, and to get it built within the very few years that it was. Vespasian only reigned for a total of 10 years. The outer wall is about 150 feet tall, 48 meters, and all told, the Colosseum, when complete, we think seated about 50,000 people. One thing that is structurally impressive is the foundation. The foundation is a concrete mat that is 12 meters thick. And must have taken an extraordinary act, both of excavation and of transportation, to basically get all of that cement, all of that rubble to the site to build the mat foundation underneath it. Now, the Pompeii amphitheater had been built into the ground and had a limited number of entrances. And there was an incident, maybe a fire, maybe just a stampede, that led to many deaths. One Roman historian said there were 10,000 deaths. We don't know if that's believable or not, but certainly an event that the authorities wouldn't want to have happened again. And so in the very earliest planning of the Colosseum, it's apparent that what was paramount was the idea that these 50,000 people had to be able to get out of the Colosseum, not just in one exit, but basically anywhere. And maybe the cleverest thing, we'll take a look at the section in a minute here, is that it's a very modern approach to circulation that really does seek to get people in and to their seats kind of right away, so that you can also turn that around and evacuate them if necessary. On the right, you can see it in what we think was its original setting, surrounded by the Forum on the left. And you can see there's a statue between the Temple of Venus and the Colosseum. This was the Colossus, the giant statue of Nero that Nero had built, and that Vespasian altered to include Vespasian's face instead of Nero's. The Colosseum derives its name from this, right? That is the original Colossus. The Colosseum is the building that is next to the Colossus. There's nothing left of the statue, although the arch and temple are both there, at least in ruin form. And to make the amphitheater, there's a fairly simple geometrical exercise, but would have been sophisticated for its day, that takes a 3-4-5 triangle and turns that into a series of arcs that guarantee that any seat in the Colosseum would have had a reasonably good view of all of the action on the floor below. This could have been laid out fairly simply with ropes and pegs using just the available technology at the time, but it shows a pretty sophisticated grasp of geometry and suggests that the layout was drawn somehow beforehand, right? That they somehow rehearsed the laying out of the building on the site. And then here's a drawing showing both that 12-meter thick mat underneath the foundation and then a glimpse of the section that we'll zoom in here and look at, but you can see the way that the tiers of seats all relate to this 3-centered or 4-centered oval that forms the geometric basis of the structure. And so here in section on the left is sort of the programmatic idea, and the idea in part, of course, is you get everyone in and out as quickly as you can, so everyone has a separate arch that they go into. The arches all have numbers on them, so you knew which one you were supposed to enter. And then there are 4 tiers of class, basically, subdivided according to social hierarchy. So the Imperial class gets to sit right closest. It gets to be closest to the action. And then as you go up, you get kind of lower and lower classes until you get the sort of working class in the top. And they sit on timber seats far from the action, but at least underneath this nice shading device. Each one of those tiers has its own set of stairs, so the classes never interact. That also, though, means that everyone has a very clean escape route, right? Everyone can leave in their own way and has access almost directly to one of the arched entrances on the outside. The section is also clever, though, because of the way that it stratifies materials. And here, as you can see, there is travertine that clads everything, at least in the original. But then it goes from concrete to brick to tufa as you go up the building. And as you can see, there are no huge spans. And the exterior actually, the wall is mostly just wall, right? There's just 1 or 2 sets of ringed arches that go around the outside. But the barrel vault is used extensively, right? Again and again and again to go over these spaces that have to be not gigantic spans, but have to be sort of big enough to accommodate the crowds they anticipated. And here you get a sense both of the kind of lower and the upper bowl, the stark division between those two, between the sort of Imperial class in the bottom and the riffraff, the cheap seats up above, but also the number of exits from those seating areas. In particular, notice that there are many, many more to get the upper classes out in a hurry. The people in the cheap seats probably have a slightly harder time of it. How the building was built, we have a couple of ideas about a construction sequence. Rathman Taylor has looked at some of the archaeological evidence and thinks that there may have been a series of traveling jib cranes that built each level one at a time and then essentially climbed the resulting structure, so built the building up and out as they went. And in particular, he notes that there are stones around the outside of the Colosseum that he hypothesizes were the stays for the last ring of cranes. So that at the very end they flip the cranes around and they use these stones in the pavement to stay the cranes and to actually lift from inside the building instead of outside. There are other kind of equally valid hypotheses that think that those stones were the stays for a large parasol that provided sun shading for most of the seats and were apparently operated by sailors. There's some textual evidence suggesting that. Either way, the end result was this gigantic pile of brick, of concrete, of travertine, engineered in several ways, both to allow for good sight lines on the interior, to present a sort of sophisticated classical face to the city, to be a monument that spoke of the emperor's power, and that moved people around in efficient ways. And we look at that section today, we look at the plan, and it fits pretty comfortably with what we know about stadium design and sort of crowd safety today. The building, of course, had a long and tortuous history. Architectural historians, of course, look at it as a sort of Roman copyism of Greek architecture. It very famously has these 3 tiers of columns going up the outside: Doric, under Ionic, under Corinthian. And this is very obviously kind of window dressing, right? Borrowing the sophistication of Greek architecture to hint not only at how powerful the emperor is, but how learned and how sort of knowledgeable in world affairs, or how civilized the emperor is as well. The building's reputation in the medieval and Renaissance world was as a martyria. The myth was that this had been one of the sites where early Christians were martyred. There's actually very little to no evidence that took place. But that became the story, and not only was the building kind of pilfered for materials for churches in the Renaissance, it was also consecrated as a shrine, as a church itself, and remains so to this day. That sort of construction, just the repeated use of the barrel vault over and over again, both in sort of cylindrical and in conical form, occurs in a number of other projects as well. Maybe most evidently the Theater of Marcellus, which is a site that's just a couple hundred yards away from the Colosseum, the other side of the Forum, which is a Greek theater, so a half bowl, but with much the same construction. And this actually occurred even earlier, right? This is a precursor actually to the Colosseum. But in addition to the barrel vaults that bridge over the circulatory areas, both of these buildings show that Roman builders were also using barrel vaults and arches as relieving structures, right? In other words, ways to channel the loads of the upper parts of the superstructure down over the voids that form the circulation. So in addition to the barrel vaults that we can see, there are these relieving vaults in both buildings. And as you can see on the right, relieving arches that take planar walls down and help to bridge them over some of the circulation areas in the Colosseum.